Hi, I'm Nichole Vogelsinger of Wild Boho. Today we are stitching a gazebo inspired by Stars Hollow. This is surrounded by the warmth of fall, which feels oh so Gilmore Girls. We have Bullion knot pumpkins, a beautiful gazebo, and shimmering beads. Let's get started with this one. Here's the inspiration behind this hoop. It is the 25th anniversary of Gilmore Girls, and so I decided to do something commemorating that. And this is the real life gazebo that Gilmore Girls was based on in New Milford, Connecticut. My son helped me create this pattern based on my real photograph from that town. So you'll want the pattern and a hoop that fits in the pattern if you're doing this as an embroidery hoop. This is an 8 by 8 inch hoop, and the pattern is sized to fit within that 8 by 8 size. So I'm going to be showing you a different way of transferring a pattern. So I have this Craft Smart graphite paper, and I just have a Fiskars stylus. You can use something like this, or you can use a pencil with a not too sharp point, or a pen. Just something that we're going to be pressing the lines of the pattern onto the fabric. You're going to need a fat quarter or even a little less of fabric, and you can use a solid, or you can see this fabric that I have has a light print that's going to be in the background of my piece. This is a cotton fabric, a linen, something that has a little bit of weight to it would be a great fabric to use for this project. You're going to start with an ironed piece of fabric. You don't want any of these creases in here because we're going to be taping the fabric down and the pattern, and we want nice crisp pattern lines. So just iron your fabric. So then you want to lay your pattern on the fabric and lay your hoop on top of that. We're going to be cutting the fabric out, and we just want to make sure that there is enough fabric all the way around. Because I'm doing a slightly different method of pattern transfer, I just want to be extra sure that I have enough fabric and I'm not shorting myself. You have seen me do classes before. You know that I normally, when I transfer patterns, I'm not normally super precise, but this time around I am going to be taping my fabric in place to my workspace. This is a more detailed pattern, and I want to make sure that I'm not going to miss anything on the pattern. So I'm just making sure the fabric is nice and straightened as I tape it down. And now with the graphite paper, you see there's a shiny side and a not shiny side. You are going to place the shiny side down on the fabric and then place the pattern whichever way you want to stitch it. You'll see there's two different versions of the pattern. You can, and I did that in case you didn't want to use this method of transfer. So you're just going to place the pattern down. Make sure that it's centered on your piece of fabric. And I am being very precise with this. And then I'm going to tape that down too. I'm just taping this at the top because I want to be able to lift my pattern and paper carefully as I'm transferring this to make sure that my lines are actually transferring. So I'm just making sure that it's secure at the top, and then I'm going to start transferring the pattern. This is where you are going to use your stylus or a dull pencil or a pen, something with a point, and you're just going to start tracing the pattern. Tracing it onto the graphite will then trace that onto the fabric, and those will be our pattern lines. So I'm just going to start with the roof area, and I'm just going to firmly press down. You'll start to be able to gauge if you are pressing hard enough. You don't want to rip your paper, so there's like a very fine line between ripping the paper and just carefully transferring the pattern. That's why I like the stylus, because it's just a dull round tip, and it's not it's not tearing at my paper. So just be careful with whatever method you try to do to transfer your pattern. And if you're using a light source and a transfer pencil like I normally do, you just transfer that the way you're comfortable transferring a pattern. And if you feel comfortable with this, you can just gently lift up your pattern, your paper, and you can see that my lines are transferring onto the fabric. So that's just a way to check to make sure that it's all going the way it should. So I'm just going to trace this whole pattern now onto my fabric. Okay, now this is always the part I hate. I've transferred the whole thing. One way you can double check is just by feeling all of the lines, and on the pattern you should be able to feel the ridges where you traced your pattern. And I'm just gonna redo that one because I think I did it, but okay, let's see what we have. Yay! There's the pattern. It's always good when it shows up right away. So now you can just untape this carefully, the pattern from the paper, and you can use this for other projects now. So just because the one section of it has been used, that doesn't mean you have to throw this paper away. You can reuse this. So if I had a smaller pattern, you can do, you know, these areas where you haven't used this. So I'm just going to fold this back up and reuse this another time. And I took everything off. You know, I'm all ready, and then I realized I did miss one line right here. So I'm just going to come back in with my water-soluble pencil, and I'm just going to draw that line in. You can use the pattern as a reference, or you can just freestyle it. Now that the pattern is traced and my little line is fixed, I'm going to hoop this up, and we are ready to get stitching. So I'm just going to center the fabric in the hoop and put the outer hoop on when I'm happy with the placement of this. I have the pattern transferred. It's centered in the hoop. I know my fabric is good. I can trim around here just a little bit, leaving about 2 inches all the way around. And then you can be sure that as you're stitching, your fabric is not getting caught behind. And it gives you some fabric to hold on to, some fabric to pull tight as you work. So the pattern is on, the fabric is in the hoop, and we are ready to get stitching. I'm going to begin with the roof of the gazebo, and I'm going to be using 2 different color greens. So this is the DMC soft cotton. This is a great thread for when you want an area to really feel full of stitches. I'm going to be working the satin stitch in each of these areas. So one of them is going to be this color and 2 are going to be this color. I'm going to be working my satin stitch horizontally rather than vertically because this is a larger area to cover vertically, and my stitches would have to stretch all the way up to here. I'd be going back and forth. I wouldn't have as many stitches, and there's also the likelihood that they would get caught on something. Like there's just too much looseness there. So that's why we're going to be working the satin stitch this way instead. So I'm just going to cut a length of thread and tie a knot at one end. I'm starting with the middle section of the gazebo. And I'm kind of basing my colors on the real life gazebo. I really like the green and white details on that one. So then I'm going to thread this through my needle, and then I'm going to begin with the middle section. I'm actually going to hold it this way because I find it easier to fill an area holding my project this way. And I'm not going to start at the bottom. I'm going to start in the center of this area. And I just want to make sure that my first stitch is straight. So I'm just double checking, and then I'm going to take it down right about there. So looking at it, that is straight. And then I'm going to do one more a little distance away. So rather than having one large area to fill, I'm going to have 3 smaller areas to fill. And breaking down these areas is going to give my stitches a chance to be fuller and smoother, which really benefits the satin stitch. So once I have my areas broken up, I'm just going to stay up here and I'm going to continue doing the satin stitch. So my stitches are going to be nice and close together. Sometimes when you're doing this, it feels like they can be a little too close, and that's a good thing. That's what you want, because you want this stitch to be nice and full. And I'm just going up and down. You'll notice I'm not taking I brought my needle down here. You'll notice that I'm coming back up here rather than here. And that is just to keep my tension and keep the stitches lining up nicely. And so once I'm done filling in this area, I'm going to work back, fill this area, and then this area. So the way that you end your satin stitch, I've come to the very end here, and my thread is still loose. What I'm going to do is wind my thread through a few of these stitches. Now with the satin stitch, you just want to be mindful that you're not pulling too tight. You don't want to stretch these stitches or pull them, especially if you have some nice volume there. So I just like to go back and wind my thread a few times without pulling it super tight. So you can see I'm just kind of like loosely pulling it through so that it's not going to come undone. And I don't need to tie a knot on this one. I just trim my thread like that. And I'm ready to start the next two sections. So for these sections, because there's an angle, you're going to do the same exact thing, but you want to angle your areas that you're breaking up so that it kind of goes with the angle of the gazebo. So you're going to do that and do the satin stitch in these two areas. I love when an area gets completed so quickly because it really gives it a shape and starts to take form quickly. Now we're going to add some beads. So we've got this area right along here by the roof, and I'm going to be using size 11 Miyukis. So I found a color, I'm going to pour these out, that match the two greens perfectly. It's going to go really well, and it's also going to give it just that little bit of shimmer because we're also going to run these beads along these lines. So I'm going to start by stitching this area along the roof. And I'm just, if you need to consult back with your pattern again, pull your pattern out. Like if your lines fade at all because you're working on it, or you just need to see a little bit more detail, just check out the pattern. This is the area that we're going to fill. You can see there's a slight curve to it, not any sharp angles or anything. I'm using the John Bead good thread. This is just a white thread, and our stitches and beads are going to be small, so we won't see any of that in our stitches. So I'm just going to bring my needle up right at the end here. And because these are so teeny tiny, I'm going to be able to fit, you can lay it down on an area to see how many beads you'll need. I'll be able to fit 2 beads along this whole roof. And so I'm just going to, it's almost like you're satin stitching, but with beads this time. So you're doing the exact same thing, bringing your needle up, putting 2 beads on the needle, just like that, and then taking it down right at the top like we did with our satin stitches. So you can see my beads right there. They're filling in this area. And I'm going to continue doing this along the whole roof line. So adding beads to this really gives us that little bit of bling along here. And now I'm going to do the same thing along the borders and these inside lines right here. So with the same thread, same beads, I'm just going to start right about here alongside the roof line. I'm going to put a bead on my needle and just stitch it down. This is going to go a little bit slower because I'm stitching 1 bead at a time. You could choose to stitch a strand of beads. However, you do risk the movement of the beads in an area like this. And I just want the little details, the little bit of shimmer that I'm getting from the beads. And so I'm fine with just stitching them on one by one as I go along, just like that. So I'm going to continue up this way and down all of the lines of the roof. You can see what a difference the beads make. It just gives it more definition. I love when I do a satin stitch, I love outlining it with something, whether it's the back stitch or whether it's beads like this. I just feel like it makes it all feel more complete. It also smooths out any edges that might be a little jagged, depending on your stitches. When you are finished with your thread for beading, the one thing you'll notice is that I do tie knots whenever I've used beads. So the same way that I showed you how we wind our thread through a few of the stitches with a satin stitch, while doing that, I also tie little knots if I am working with beads. So that's just the one difference between stitching with beads or stitching without beads, the way that you'll tie things off. So now I have this little point at the top of the gazebo, and I wanted to show you how to determine what size beads to use. So I have two size beads. I have the size 8 check seed beads, and I have the E beads from Toho, which are a size 6. If you're not sure what size bead to use, you can see that this is a little bit wider at the bottom and narrower at the top. So I just put 3 of the smaller size 8 beads on my needle, and I'm just gonna hold it in place here and see what I think of that look. I think that that looks good. But I'm also going to try that with the size, with the Toho ones, the larger beads, just to see what I think of that. And I think that looks good too. And so then the other option is to mix and match sizes, which I love doing. So I would, actually I want to switch it around this way, the wider or the larger beads on the bottom. Something kind of like this. So just kind of holding it in place. I actually think I like I think I might like that better, even with the color differences. And I think I'm going to add one more bead, one more of the tiny size 8 beads at the top of that. So that's an easy way to just gauge what size beads you want to use before you go to the actual commitment of stringing them on the thread and stitching them down. Although, even if you do that and you stitch something down and you're not thrilled with it, the worst that happens is you just cut it out. So you can always experiment with beads, but that's just a quick way to kind of gauge what size beads you want to use for a project. So I have threaded my needle again, and I'm just going to bring it up at the top where I want my beads to begin. And I'm going to add the 2 larger beads. And you'll notice I'm not going through the fabric right now. I'm just stringing the beads in the order that I want them to show up. I'm going to add one more green bead like that. I think that works perfectly for the spire at the top of this. And so now I'm taking my needle down just like that. And to give it a little bit more security, I'm going to bring my needle up again at the base of the beads right there. And I'm going to take it through all of the beads one more time. When I'm stringing longer strands of beads or multiple beads on one thread like this, I like to do that just to give it a little bit more security. And honestly, I really think I could go through one more time. Just because this is the focal point of this gazebo, I want it to be stitched on there nice. That's perfect. And so now I just tie my thread off, and because I have beads, I'm doing the same thing. I'm taking it through a few of the threads, tying my knot, and then trimming off the thread. So next I'm going to focus on the pillars or the columns of the gazebo. And for these, I'm bringing out the Cylin beads. So these are the new beads from John Bead. And when I was designing this pattern with my son, I wanted to create something that would be perfectly sized to use with the Cylin beads. And I absolutely love these because they are tiny and delicate. You can see how little they are. And I'm going to compare them with the Miyukis because I'm going to be incorporating some of these in too. And I just want you to see them like side by side to see the difference. So I should have probably picked a different color other than clear to show you. Let's compare them to these Miyukis so that you can see side by side what they look like. So the Miyukis are a little bit more delicate. The Cylin beads are nice and tiny too, which I love. And you can really get the tiny little details in a project like this with these smaller beads. So you'll notice like a lot of my projects, I use like bigger, heavier beads. But when I'm scaling it down and I really want it to be detailed, that's when I pull out these little tiny beads. And even though they can take longer to stitch on and you need to be a little bit more patient, it is definitely worth the effort because by the end you just get really cool details. So the Miyukis side by side are just a tiny bit tinier. And so I'm going to be using them interchangeably with this. But first I'm going to be stitching the Cylin beads down. And you'll notice on the pattern that each of the post has like two sections. So one section I'm going to be stitching with the Cylin beads and one section I'm going to be stitching with the Miyukis. That's just a personal choice. You might look at mine and say, no, I want to do something different with yours, and that is perfectly fine. That is the fun of a project like this. So I'm just starting down at the bottom of this post, bringing my thread through. I'm using the same exact thread, and I'm going to gauge how the Cylin beads will fit on here. So I'm going to do the same thing to fit perfectly in this post. And so I'm just going to be stitching them down exactly the same way that I was stitching up here. So the same technique. And actually, I don't like how that looks. I'm going to take that out. I didn't give myself enough thread. See, when that happens, the worst thing that happens if you make a mistake with your beads, and I'm glad I can show you this. What did I have to do? I just took out my thread and the beads come out. So don't be afraid to make mistakes with this or to experiment with things that might not turn out right, because the worst thing that happens is you cut your thread and your beads out and then you choose something different or you move on to something else. So there's my beads, and now I'm going to do the same exact thing and line this whole post with my Cylin beads. So side by side, stitched together, you can see the Cylin beads and then the Miyukis. So I wanted to add a little bit of definition to these posts because these lines are close together. And so by switching up the colors, it's going to give it that dimension that it needs. And it's two of the Cylin beads side by side and then one single Miyuki there. So I'm just going to do the same exact thing with all the other poles on the gazebo. Well, it's already looking more Stars Hollow, isn't it? So we have the beads along here, both colors. Now I'm going to show you an additional step that you can add to just finish this off. So I am back stitching along each of the column areas right here, and then I'm satin stitching the railing, so right along here. So I'm going to show you the satin stitch. The thread that I am using, Wonderfil's Dazzle. I love this thread because it is a metallic, but also it's not a metallic that's tricky to stitch with. And if you've ever stitched with metallic threads, you know exactly what I'm talking about. This metallic really is a joy to stitch with. Sometimes metallic threads retain the shape of being folded up. This does not do that. You can see it really has some movement to it, and that translates into the stitching and makes it a really nice thread to stitch with. So I'm going to start with the length of that, and I knot the end of my thread. And now I'm just going to start up here. I'm bringing my needle up, and I'm keeping my stitches really close to the beads along the edge of where the beads end. And then I'm going to bring my needle up again right about here. And I'm just working back to each stitch, keeping my stitches nice and small. And I'm going to work my way all the way down till I get to the railing doing this. So that's what it looks like when I add the back stitch. And now I'm not even stopping my thread because I have enough thread here. And I'm just going to start making tiny satin stitches. Now, if you've watched my videos before of any satin stitching that I do, I usually break areas up. And an area like this, I would normally do a few foundation stitches or stitches to kind of divide the area up to help keep your stitches nice and neat and straight. Because this is such a narrow space that I'm filling in, I'm not going to do that. But if you feel more comfortable doing it that way and you've seen me stitch that way before, then by all means do that. I know that I'm going to be able to keep my stitches nice and tiny and lined up. So I did my first stitch, and now all of my other stitches are just going to be lined up really close to that previous stitch. You don't want any space in between your stitches. So it feels like you're stitching them. It almost feels like you're kind of overlapping them because the needle is going so close to your previous stitch. But this will just help keep this feeling full and full of your satin stitches. And I'm just continuing this all the way down the railing. So now that your railing is done and stitched in exactly the same way, just with the addition of the satin stitch, we're going to focus on the rest of the gazebo. So anything else that is white, like the railings, the steps, the part of the roof up here, we're going to leave the little finials or the more decorative bits. We're going to do beadwork on those. But everything else, we are going to do the back stitch. So you can do back stitch, you can do a combination of that and satin stitch since we've done both of those stitches. Just start by outlining things in back stitch and then decide if you want to satin stitch the insides. I'm just going to start by back stitching everything and then pick places here and there that I want to satin stitch. And the thread that I'm going to be using for this, I want a little bit heavier of a thread. So this is the DMC soft cotton. This comes off of the skein like this, and it doesn't need to be separated into strands. So it's a little different than the DMC floss. I like this for when you want a bolder stitching line, and that's what we want for the rest of the gazebo. So I'm just going to be using this to stitch the remaining white parts of the gazebo. So as you are working your way through this and satin stitching, you'll notice that on the pattern, there are the parts of the wooden gazebo that you see that are kind of behind the gazebo, and then the parts that are more prominent in front of the gazebo. To differentiate that on the pattern, I'm using two different colors. So I'm using my white that I used for all the back stitching, for all the details on the main part of the gazebo. And then when you look at the reverse side of the wood of the gazebo, I am using, this is the Eleganza. The color, in case you're trying to find the exact color, is EZM78. And you can see, comparing the two, what I wanted to find, and if you're looking for a contrasting thread, I wanted something that wasn't white, so that when you look at this, there is a noticeable difference between the two parts of the gazebo, so that it's not all completely white blending together. I also wanted something with a slightly different texture, which this has. This is a pearl cotton. And so when you look at the two threads, the soft cotton is much thicker and the pearl cotton has a small twist to it. It's a little bit shinier than the matte of the cotton. So just try and find a thread that is going to look a little different. It doesn't have to be completely off because it's just the reverse side of the gazebo that you're working on. But to try and make it look a little bit more realistic and not to get blurry when you look at it, I did choose two different colors. I'm going to continue the satin stitching. The floor of the gazebo that you can see peeking through here, that is going to be the same green that I used up here. The same thing with the steps. For the steps, I'm going to use one of these along with a green. So for the risers, I'm going to use one color, and for the flat part of the step, I'm going to use another color. Again, just to differentiate things. And when you look at the actual picture of the gazebo, there are two different colors on that. You can really see what a difference it makes when these areas start to get filled in, and especially the different colors with the steps and the gazebo. So for the flooring of the gazebo, I did use the soft cotton. I stitched it with the back stitch so that it looks like floorboards, and it looks different than the satin stitch that I stitched everywhere else. For the panels down here, which are kind of covered up by pumpkins and the hay bale, I used the size 5 eleganza pearl cotton. It gives, using the variegated color, gives this just a little bit of variety in the green. It also makes it look just a little different than the other areas of green that I've used. And because this is mainly 2 or 3 colors, this whole project, it helps to vary the threads a little bit just so you get a variety of textures. So when I used the eleganza back here and the soft cotton, we've got 2 different textures going on. Using the soft cotton here with the eleganza here, we've got lots of different textures. We used the Cylin beads here, which are perfectly sized, and so they are great for the columns because they line up really nicely. And then we use the Miyuki shinier beads there. I want to show you another method for adding beads. So we're going to add beads to these sections here, and then any other white areas, any other areas that you want to fill in with beads, this is the method that I'm going to be using. So let's work on this area first. So I'm going to be using the Miyuki size 11s again, the same ones that I used on the roof of the gazebo. Now with these, we stitched them on 1 by 1 or 2 by 2, and we really wanted a nice straight line with those. In this area, we still want our straight line, but we're stitching in groups of beads. So I'm bringing my thread up, and I'm just going to put, I'm guessing maybe 5 or 6 beads on my needle. We're going to just gauge, I'll put 4 on, we'll see about where that takes us. I think I can do one more. So you can see how I'm just gauging the size by laying my beads and thread down. Before I'm actually even going to take it down through the fabric, I just gauge where it's going to land. So I've got 5 beads on there, and I'm coming down. I'm just filling this area like we have the diamond shape on the pattern. We're filling it in here. So you can see the beads lay nice and flat in that area. I'm going to stitch another row right next to them. I don't, maybe I'll need the same amount for this one. So when you're stitching beads, you can stitch them 1 by 1 like we did on a lot of this pattern, or you can stitch them in longer rows like this to fill up an area. I'm going to finish filling this, and then we're going to work on another method for adding the beads. So there are our diamonds on the fencing, which look really cool and just really start to make this look complete. Now I want to show you this a little bit from the side. So this area here is all beads that I added, and you can see, looking at it closely from the side, there is a lot more dimension there than there is in the areas where we stitched the beads on flat. Sometimes it's nice to have different areas of dimension on a project, and so this area on the pattern where the stairs were, along here, I am adding stacks of beads. We're also going to be doing the little decorative bits up here in green. Not stacks of beads, but more dimensional areas of beads, just to have it, again, we've got our different textures, our different finishes of the beads. It just helps because we're using so much of the same color. It helps to break it up with different textures. So we're going to start right about here. And I'm just going to be filling this area in with beads. However, instead of stitching them on flat, like we did here, or one by one, like we did in this area, we are going to be stitching little clumps of beads or longer stitches with beads. So I'm using the size 11 Miyuki seed beads. These have a shinier finish. And I'm putting a few more beads on than my area needs. So you can see if I laid it down flat, it would be in the green area. I'm keeping that many beads on, and now I'm just taking my needle in this white area. So that's going to keep the beads all in there. And I'm just stitching like that. I'm going to vary the heights of the beads. So I'm going to add a few more right here. So some rows are going to be a little bit like bumpier than others. You can see from the side, there's what that looks like. And this is just going to fill in this area really nicely, give it some dimension, and a little bit of height, which is what we want for this area. So I'm just varying how many beads are going on here. And your areas, every area that you fill in is going to need a different amount of beads because there's some skinnier areas, but I'm just going to work my way up here all the way around to make it look a little bit different than all of the other white sections. I'm also going to do the same thing. I'm going to be using 2 different colored green beads up here to do all of those decorative areas. And again, just like we had the 2 different shades of white when we're seeing the back of the boards here and the front of the boards here, I'm going to be doing the same thing up here. So I'm going to have 2 different color greens, one for the front facing decorative finial areas and one for the when we're seeing like the reverse of those. So grab your beads and just stitch on the rest of this gazebo, and then the last bits that we have are just the haystacks and the pumpkins. Okay, so we have finished the gazebo. You can see the detailing with the beads. I used a combination of the Miyuki size 11s and the Miyuki size 11s that are 2 different finishes. So we have the shinier finish and the more matte finish, and just a close-up of what they look like. I also used the white beads for the detailing around the bottom of the gazebo. And now we are going to focus first on the haystack and then on the pumpkins. And the haystack is going to have an outline of, you guessed it, the back stitch. So start with that. I am using a soft cotton. Again, I want a thicker thread that is going to stand out a little bit. So I'm going to do my back stitch in that. So once you've done your back stitch and the hay bale is all outlined, we're going to start adding some texture. And the texture is going to come in the form of both stitches and beads. So for my stitches, I'm using just a different color of the soft cotton. And I am going to be randomly stitching just straight lines on here. So I just want to kind of picture what a hay bale looks like, or a straw bale. It's very random. There's bits sticking out everywhere. And we are just going to stitch that right now. Your stitches are going to overlap. This is going to take a little bit of thread, but it's going to work up very quickly, you'll find. So you can see I'm just overlapping some of the stitches. You can let little bits of it hang over the edges because that's what it would look like in real life. And you're just going to stitch. You can mix your colors. I might mix a little bit of this color in as well. And then we're going to start adding some bugle beads. So you can decide how much thread you want to use. And the next part, you can decide also how many types of bugle beads you want to use. So I have 3 different colors. I have some Miyukis, and then I have just the check seed beads. Or I'm sorry, just the check bugles. So you can see together they are great colors, and they will look perfect as a bale of hay. So I'm going to thread my needle with the good thread again. And I'm just going to start down here, bringing my needle up. I'm going to put a bugle bead on my needle. And just kind of maneuver it down. You can, again, decide where you want this to be. We are going to have some of these overlapping with the other beads, overlapping with the thread. So I'm just going to start with one color and move around this, and then pick another color and do the same exact thing until the whole bale is filled up. So they're laying nice and flat. And I'm just going to be doing that. So again, you might be using just one color of bugle bead and several colors of the thread, or you might decide you don't want any thread at all and you just want to use all bugle beads. That is your decision, and this is where you can really make this your own and modify the supplies however you see fit. I just love how the haystack looks in this piece. You can really see the shine from it. It's got lots of texture when you look up close. And now we are going to work on the pumpkins. So the pumpkins, I am stitching the bullion knot. I have 2 different threads. I definitely recommend a certain type of thread with the bullion knot. I find that a size 5 pearl cotton works really, really well. I don't like to go thicker than this because the knots just don't look as nice when you use a thicker thread. You can also use a stranded thread. However, I find that sometimes it gets a little tangly using a thread like that. So if you can use a pearl cotton, I definitely recommend that. You'll also want a milliner's needle for this stitch. You want a needle that is, the milliner's needle is one size the whole length of the needle. So the tip or the point is not a graduated point. And that's what you want for a stitch like this. I also find it helpful to use an embroidery stand just to hold my piece in place. This is the Nerge tabletop stand, and I find that it really helps me. It's like my third hand when I'm doing embroidery. So for my pumpkin, I'm just going to choose this one right here. I'm doing all bullion knots on this one. For this one or this one, I might do beads, but I might stick with the bullion knots just in a different color. And I'm kind of going to be ignoring these lines. So these lines are here if you want to use beads. They will help you. You can choose a different color bead for each section. With the bullion knot, I'm kind of following these lines, but I don't need to stay within them as long as I'm staying within the shape of the pumpkin. So the lines are there for if you're using beads. If you wanted to try the satin stitch instead, the lines will be helpful. But for the bullion knot, you don't need them. And we're just going to be working from bottom to top. So I'm just going to start right about here. And I'm bringing my needle up. This is a great stitch to kind of work with curves in your pattern. So I'm bringing my needle up. Wherever you take your needle down, that's where your stitch is going to end. So I'm just going to take my needle down right about here. I'm not pulling my thread all the way through. So I'm going to keep some of it out and I'm holding on to that. And then I'm going to bring my needle back up right where I brought it up at first. And because this is my first stitch, you just want to make sure that you're pushing the knot from the back of your fabric. Just push that away so that you're not going through the knot. Now you're going to have a piece of thread that doesn't move and a piece that does move. This is still, you can take this above and below the fabric. You are going to hold on to the piece of thread that doesn't move, and you're just going to start twisting it counterclockwise around your needle. You don't want your twist to be very tight, but you also don't want it so loose that it's coming undone the whole time. So you're going to work on mastering the tension of your bullion knots. And you want to have enough twists so that when you lay your needle down, you can see that it's going just a tiny bit beyond where I'm going to be taking my needle down. So that spot where I came up with my needle, my twists extend a little bit beyond that. And so I am good. And I just lost a few of them. If that happens, you twist again. Okay, so now you're going to hold on to the twists and you're going to pull your needle and thread all the way through. And once your needle and thread are coming through the twists, you don't have to worry about them coming undone. They're in place now, and so you can let go of them and you can slide them around. You can just maneuver them into place. And then at the end, you're going to take your needle down. And try not to get any knots. This is a stitch where it is very easy to get knots in your thread because you are twisting a thread and pulling it through your fabric. Your thread is always going to be a little twisted, and so sometimes you need to stop and let the twist come out of the thread and unwind before you start again, and that will make it a little bit easier. So I'm going to show you another one. This is a great stitch for kind of overlapping. So you can see this stitch, I'm going to use my little scissors to, it's still movable and I've got a little bit of space right here. So I'm going to bring my needle up and I'm just kind of tucking another little stitch in here. I'm going to take my needle down and remember, I'm not pulling the thread all the way through and I'm just holding on to it. And then I'm going to bring my needle up again, right there at the bottom. And I'm twisting the thread that doesn't move. So I'm just twisting. You're kind of moving your needle and thread at the same time. So your hand underneath the fabric is moving the needle, while your hand above the fabric is twisting the thread. And you can lay it down to gauge if you have enough twists. I'm just going to add another one or two. And now I'm going to hold my thread and bring my needle through. And remember, once it's at this point, you can let go and you don't have to worry about losing any of your twists. And then you're just going to kind of work them into place. It's just a little bit of maneuvering before you take your needle down. I just like to make sure that they're all in place. You can use your needle, you can use your fingers, and then you're going to take the needle down where your stitch ends, just like that. So what's going to be cool with the pumpkin, I'm going to show this to you from the side. There is a lot of dimension on this stitch, so you can see how much it extends off of the fabric. It's movable, it has dimension, and the cool thing is that you really can twist these stitches and let them intertwine And so that's what I'm going to do with this pumpkin. I'm going to continue my stitches. You will go through a decent amount of thread. They take a lot of thread, but the effect is definitely going to be worth it. So you can see with my pumpkins, I began each pumpkin with the bullion knots, exactly like how I showed you. And then I used the size 11 Miyukis in 2 different color oranges. And I just layered them over and kind of intertwined them the same exact way that we were adding the beads to the white part along the gazebo and the green parts of the gazebo. You're just kind of randomly placing them in that pumpkin shape. So from the side, you can see there's lots of dimension. I don't know if it shows up that great on the video, but in person, you can definitely tell there's a lot of dimension. So you can either end here, which is, I mean, you're completely done the pattern, or you can add a little bit to the background. This is, after all, my stitched in Stars Hollow style, and my fabric does, conveniently enough, have some stars on it. So I am just going to add a few of the bead landing, the Preciosa check crystals, just to the center of a few of these stars. Not all of them, but just a few here and there to give it a little bit of sparkle. So I'm just going to bring my needle up in one of these stars, and I'm going to add my crystal just like that to my needle. I can lay it flat on here just to make sure that it's lined up right. And then I'm going to take my needle down. Now with a larger bead like this, I always take my needle and thread through a second time just to make sure that it's nice and secure on the fabric. And I'm just going to continue doing that with a few of these background stars. See the sparkle of the crystals. I used 2 different colors, and I really think that this finishes it. So whether or not your fabric has stars actually printed on it, you might be using a solid fabric. The addition of these crystals, I think, really adds a lot to it, and you can stitch your own stars and add the crystals that way. And I think I am finished. So now all that's left is to finish up this hoop. So the last thing to do is to pull your fabric tight in the hoop, and then you are going to trim around the edges. You want to trim enough that you can fold it over in the back and that it's not going to touch this fabric. And when you do, you're going to grab your school glue and run a strip of glue along the back of the hoop, the white part or the wooden part if you're using a wooden hoop. So I just run that all the way around, and then I start folding my fabric over. So you want enough glue that it's actually going to hold the fabric in place, but not so much glue that it's going to be running over the sides and making a mess. So once I run my strip of glue, I just fold it over. You can see it already starts to stay in place. And then I'm just going to let it dry for a few hours to make sure that it's not going to stick on anything once I set it up against a wall or put it on a shelf. I'm just going to give it some time to harden on here and dry. All right, here we have the hoop guts for the gazebo. And let's flip it around and check out the final piece. Look how much sparkle there is just in turning this over and adding the check crystals throughout here. I added a little bit more than I thought I was going to, because once I started adding them, I was afraid it was going to be a little too busy. But honestly, I'm thrilled with how they look and the little bit of shine they give, and I feel like it really completes the piece. These pumpkins, I can't get over. I just love them so much. I love adding the bullion knots and those beads on top. It gives the color variation that I wanted, but each one like really stands out, and I just, yeah, I'm thrilled with this piece, and it feels so Stars Hollow to me. The bow is complete, glowing with beadwork, surrounded by stitched pumpkins. I just love how these little details capture that quiet autumn in Stars Hollow kind of feeling. Thank you so much for spending your creative time with me, and happy stitching!